Few search results on Google. Indeed, the assassin who murdered Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and shot State Senator John Hoffman repeatedly used People Search, websites run by data brokers to learn the home addresses of the victims. I also recognize that members of Congress receive untold numbers of violent and harassing threats as a result of our job. And I want to credit the bipartisan effort in the Senate Commerce Committee to provide privacy protections for members of Congress. I do not intend to stand in the way of their legislation. The bill I offer today takes the privacy protections against data brokers in the Commerce Committee bill and extends them to all Americans. Protecting everyone is the most effective way to protect U.S. military and intelligence personnel, including undercover officers. There have been numerous press reports over the past few years revealing how data brokers are selling sensitive location data collected from U.S. personnel working at military bases and other sensitive facilities, and are willing to actually sell this data to foreign buyers. Members of Congress should not receive special treatment. Our constituents deserve protections from violence, stalking, and other criminal threats. For that reason, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S. 2850, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Reserving the right to object. I thank my friend, the senator from Oregon, for his passion for privacy. And he has had a passion for protecting privacy his entire tenure in the Senate, as have I. And his passion is genuine. And I believe we have an obligation, a bipartisan obligation, to do more to protect the privacy of Americans, especially kids, but to protect the privacy of Americans across the board. We also are well aware we live in a time where violence is on the rise. There is enormous division, there is enormous anger and hatred. The entire world was shocked just a couple of weeks ago at the assassination of Charlie Kirk by a deranged gunman who inscribed his political agenda on the shell casings as he murdered a husband and father of two. Just last week, I was in Dallas, where another deranged gunman opened fire at an ICE facility, killing two. Again, that deranged gunman inscribed his political agenda on the shell casings. I wish we did not face this partisan anger. I wish we did not face these threats of violence. A previous Congress passed legislation protecting the personal information of federal judges because, sadly, too many federal judges and their families have been targeted for violence. That legislation was bipartisan, it passed into law, and it has had some modicum of success protecting federal judges and their families. In this instance, Senator Klobuchar, a Democrat, and myself have teamed up together to extend the same protections of privacy that federal judges have to members of Congress and to their staffs. We are all blessed to represent our states, and yet we know that there are threats of violence that come with this job. Collectively, the 100 of us in this chamber have faced thousands and thousands of death threats and threats of violence. Our staff have been victims of violence over and over again. And so this legislation is bipartisan legislation to enhance the safety and security of members of Congress and their staffs. Now, Senator Wyden has suggested broadening that to all Americans. I admire that sentiment and agree with that sentiment. There are challenges, however, with the language he has drafted. The language he has drafted, as presently written, could, among other things, prevent law enforcement and parents from knowing where convicted sexual predators are living. It could have the effect of gutting Megan's laws that have been adopted all across this country. So what I have offered to Senator Wyden is to work with him in good faith. I chair the Commerce Committee. I've already offered to convene a hearing examining how we can expand privacy protections more broadly, but do so in a way that doesn't disrupt law enforcement, doesn't disrupt legitimate interests such as knowing where sexual predators are living and making sure they're not living near young children, near daycares, near schools. Because the legislation as submitted by the senator from Oregon has not yet worked through those issues, I reiterate my offer to work in a bipartisan manner to find an expansion of the legislation that is under consideration that would work effectively, but in the meantime, I object.
Objection is heard. Senator from
Mr.
Oregon.
President, the senator from Texas has offered to do a hearing on my proposal, and I do appreciate that. I simply believe it's unfortunate when the Senate will pass privacy protections for ourselves, but not for all Americans. And only shady data brokers, would-be murderers and stalkers, as well as foreign adversaries buying data on U.S. government officials are actually going to benefit from blocking this bill. However, understanding that my colleague has made his arguments believing that my legislation goes too far, I also have a narrower piece of legislation tailored specifically to 3 groups of people who face elevated risks of violence, doxing, and stalking, similar to members of Congress and our staff. This bill is also modeled on the bipartisan Commerce Committee bill and protects members of Congress and staff. Additionally, it protects state and local officials, including state judges, who were left out of an earlier judicial privacy bill. The threat to state and local officials has not gone away. Just this week, a gunman fired a bullet directly into the home of a state senator in Illinois. This legislation protects survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence who deserve the strongest possible safeguards against being stalked or harmed. Mr. President, even if a member objects to protecting all Americans, surely the people doing our jobs in state capitals across the country and those who've suffered assault and violence deserve the same protection as you and I. Therefore, as if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S. 2851 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that this bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
reserving the right to object for the same reasons I articulated a minute ago. I am quite sympathetic to the concerns raised by the senator from Oregon, and he is right. There are threats against state and local officials. Those threats are serious, and they deserve to be dealt with seriously. In my view, violence is never acceptable, and that is whether I agree with you politically or I disagree with you politically. We should debate civilly, with respect, with decency, and violence should never be the answer. And so, just as I did with his previous amendment, I extend my offer in the hearing we convene to consider the issue of state and local officials, to consider how best to expand the protection. I'm interested in expanding the protection to as wide a universe as is feasible, as is practicable, but that answer is not yet worked out. State and local officials is a universe that comprises tens of thousands, if not more people than that. And we should have hearings and consider the effect before passing legislation that, if the bill got expanded, would engender an objection to this bill and kill the entire bill altogether. Because I don't want this body to do nothing and to fail to take a reasonable common sense step to protect the security of members of Congress and their staffs, and because I very much want to pass Senator Klobuchar's legislation, which I might note, Senator Klobuchar is a Democrat, I'm a Republican. This is bipartisan legislation. Because this amendment at that time, I believe, would imperil the Senate doing anything right now, I object.
I'm going to close with this.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Thank you. I want to tell my colleague from Texas I look forward to to the hearings on legislation that will ensure that all Americans have these protections, because as you and I have talked about, I think it's critically important there not be a double standard in America. I thank my colleague for the offer of the hearings. Mr. President, I yield.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, along with Senator Gary Peters, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate observe a moment of silence in this chamber to honor the 4 people and many more wounded yesterday in Grand Blanc Township.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I rise on behalf of the community of Grand Blanc, a community in unspeakable pain, grief, and anger. I stand on the floor of the U.S. Senate as Michigan's junior senator, along with our senior senator, Gary Peters, to represent and honor what has gone on in our community. At 10:30 yesterday morning, a man drove a car into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc Township. The gunman set fire to the building and started shooting. At this time, 4 are deceased, more are injured and at the hospital. And in this small community, just 15 minutes from my own community, we are shocked to the core. In addition to mourning the dead, we pray for the injured. We pray for the community that will be living with the effects of this for months and years to come. And we thank the professionals who are taking care of those in shock today. Everywhere you go in Michigan, whether I was picking up a cup of coffee or picking up my dry cleaning, Michiganders are very raw. I think the most important thing first is to thank our first responders, but also use them as an example. The first officer was on the scene 30 seconds after the 911 call. And it took law enforcement 8 minutes to neutralize the shooter. 8 minutes. They did a masterful job addressing an incredibly complex act of violence, and their efforts are what are keeping people afloat. I want to give special recognition to 2 officers, one from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the other a Grand Blanc Township police officer who happened to be in the area close by and risked their lives to protect the innocent. They did not wait. They ran towards the danger without hesitation, and they are heroes today. I visited Grand Blanc Township this morning. We made a point to go, both Democratic and Republican elected leaders, local, state, and federal. What I saw in the community is confusion and deep pain that something like this could happen in this small place. It's a community where fender benders are much more common than any kind of violent crime. And there's a feeling of pain that such a senseless and useless act of violence happened in our community. I think it's important to learn that lesson from law enforcement, from everyone I talked to, whether it was local law enforcement, our state folks, our federal folks. They all said we just all joined in. We didn't think. They put their heads down and they started protecting people. That is the example I hope we can all learn as we try to understand this moment in our country's history. We have a problem in this country. We have an epidemic in this country, and we have to acknowledge that. The only way we get better is by acknowledging we have a problem. We have a problem with mental health, and we have a problem that people think violence is a legitimate option in voicing disagreement in our system. Whether it was the death of Charlie Kirk, state legislators in Minnesota, people worshiping in Grand Blanc, those who attacked the President of the United States. It's normal to look for an ideology and a reason why they would perpetrate these kinds of attempts or these kinds of attacks. But I think more than anything, what I ask Michiganders and ask Americans to do is look not for the specific reason why, but understand that what is happening in our country, we are signaling that we are unwell. We are unwell. Whether it's in Nevada or Michigan, people are unwell. And we have to understand that it is our responsibility to address that. Now, in Michigan, we unfortunately have had 5 mass shootings in the past 4 years. Oxford High School, Michigan State University, the Splash Pad in Rochester Hills, another church in Wayne, Michigan, and now Grand Blanc Township is added to this sick fraternity of communities that have to endure this kind of violence. And I would dare say that myself, I experienced today, this is the 4th time I have personally dealt with one of these mass shootings, and I can see that it desensitizes you after all these times. You get used to it in a way that I just can't reconcile. It was important for us to come together, Democrats and Republicans, to put out the message that please take a breath, don't watch everything social media is putting forward. Learn from our law enforcement officials to be serious and judicious, and let us all be leaders in our own lives. Either you are working every day in your community to make things better, or you are working to split people apart. Now, this targeted violence was meant to terrorize us. It's meant to make us scared in our houses of worship, where people were just trying to pray on a Sunday morning. It is meant to terrorize us in our high schools, in our colleges, in our places of political discourse, on our university campuses. But what it does by making us afraid, it is infringing on our freedom. If people don't feel that they can go to their sanctuaries, the place where they and their children are supposed to be safe, that is infringing on our freedom. So I would say we must acknowledge as Americans that we have an illness. And the symptom is this extreme violence that is being perpetrated on our most innocent civilians. So I hope today, after a long month of violence across the country, that Democrats and Republicans, especially in this body, can rise above the petty political games and come together to get to work on this epidemic. It is our responsibility as leaders. It is our responsibility as the people look to us to lead. And I just encourage every American to rise above the anger and vitriol of this moment and instead focus on our communities and what we need to come together and heal. And with that, Mr. President, I yield to my senior senator, Gary Peters.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I, along with my Senate colleague from Michigan, Elissa Slotkin, are heartbroken and appalled to stand here today as we grieve yet another tragedy in our home state of Michigan. On Sunday, Grand Blanc Township experienced unimaginable violence when a gunman drove his car into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, fired gunshots at the members of the congregation, and then started a massive fire using gasoline that destroyed most of the church building. This was shocking, it was horrific, and it was a violent attack on a quiet and peaceful community. There are now families whose loved ones will never return their call, never hug them back, and never sit by their side as they practice their faith. I'm devastated to share the ages of these individuals that ranged from just 6 years old to 78 years old. I simply can't imagine the agony that their families are now experiencing. There are also 8 other victims who remain in critical condition in the hospital, with their families waiting anxiously by their side. My thoughts are with them as we hope and pray for their safe recovery. This was the kind of horror that you don't want to believe is even possible in our world, let alone in our own community. But unfortunately, this is not the first time that I've stood at this podium after senseless acts of violence devastated parents, siblings, children, friends, and neighbors in my state. That's why a part of me feels this terrible sadness today for the pain and loss that was inflicted upon Grand Blanc Township and the greater community. But I also feel just immense outrage, because there are no words to describe the pain and the devastation and confusion you experience at these moments. Pain for the senseless loss of life, devastation for the sense of fear that no matter how hard we work to heal, this despicable act has shattered this quiet community. And our utter confusion as to how someone could have the capacity to inflict this kind of evil. We know that our nation is plagued by an epidemic of gun violence. More than 100 Americans will die from gun violence each and every day in our country. We also know that there has been a rise in violent threats and deadly attacks targeting churches, synagogues, mosques, and other houses of worship in communities all across our country. We cannot allow these patterns of violence to continue. We cannot simply accept these attacks like it's another normal day. It is not. And despite what people may tell us, there's far more that unites us than divides us. Now more than ever, we need to come together and hold each other up. And once we have grieved, we must work together to find solutions that will prevent this kind of tragedy from devastating more communities. It's certainly past time to enact sensible gun reform and ensure that every American can practice their faith without fear for their lives. It is certainly past time to take the temperature down on our politics, a growing sickness that has undoubtedly contributed to the rise of polarization and hate-fueled violent attacks across our country. The bottom line is that the time to act is now. There is simply no other option. I want to once again share my deepest condolences for the families and loved ones of the victims of this absolutely horrific attack. My heart breaks for the entire community and everyone that has been impacted by this catastrophic event. I also want to thank the law enforcement and emergency personnel who responded immediately to this harrowing scene. In fact, 2 law enforcement officers engaged the shooter in less than a minute. And as a result, there is no question that countless lives were saved. Their profound bravery and heroism can never be forgotten, as well as a courageous community members who acted quickly to shield women, children, and the elderly from gunfire. And finally, I want to thank the numerous local, state, and federal agencies who have stepped in to support the victims and their loved ones and ensure a thorough investigation is carried out. Mr. President, Michiganders are tough. Michiganders are resilient. But most importantly, they're kind. And on Sunday, that kindness showed through as we saw so many people race to help in the aftermath of this appalling attack. As we remember the victims, and as we remember their loved ones and the community members who are still grieving, I hope those actions not only provide some form of comfort, but also show that heroism and kindness in the face of unspeakable tragedy is truly who we are as Americans.